Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Gareth.
So what is it we're going to explore today in this conversation? And what is this conversation going to actually inform people about?
So if people are looking to really understand what the EPRC is about in depth and detail, this is the very long-form interview and discussion that will help explain many aspects of the project. We also have a white paper, which is a very, very large, many-page document that explains this, but it would take many hours for someone to read it and go all through it. It's really more of a wiki, and it's quite elaborate with many studies and plans and details and explanations. So if someone is looking for even more than they find in this video, they can find it in the white paper. But as people like videos, they like seeing interaction, this we think is a much more fun way to explain the deep dive into what the EPRC is about, what Emergence Benefactors, the charity is that funds it, and how the whole project works, what it hopes to accomplish, what are its parts and aspects, and so that people will have hopefully a very thorough understanding of what we're about after watching this video.
Yeah, and so you are the founder and the sort of a visionary behind some of this.
I am one of the founders and visionaries behind this. There's actually a bunch of us, but I have been working on this in various ways for a long time, depending on when you want to say the beginning is. So it's great to have you here so that we can explore all the aspects of this very large project.
Well, one of the reasons I'm excited to be here is I feel, we have different backgrounds and coming from different places. However, I really see the value in what it is you are all doing together. And I think it's extremely differentiated. I mean, personally, I feel like healthcare as a whole, the systems touch everyone in the world in so many different ways. And I have felt in my life when I'm going through something, having been met in some of the clinical settings, it's felt a little bit rigid at times and limiting to my experiences. And when I have been able to find context and settings to explore aspects of my experience that would maybe considered something like woo-woo or spiritual or something that just doesn't have any context in mainstream world and is more mysterious and unknown. And when I found context to explore that in, it's felt very expansive and felt more in line with healing inside me on a quest for wholeness and to embrace my wholeness as a human. And so adding that in to a traditional clinical setting, which is already so potent and scalable and powerful, and being able to blend these worlds and have more flexibility just feels so exciting to me. And I'm really on board for all the different types of ways this can help people and help as a whole and a collective move towards a really thriving, healthy life.
And not only you and me, but most of my social circle has had experiences or had questions or run into issues around what we're calling emergent phenomena that most mainstream clinical providers would be relatively out of their depth in, or perhaps totally out of their depth in. And that is obviously a totally suboptimal situation, where what we really need is a healthcare system that understands this dimension of human experience in a very sophisticated, thorough, well-studied, functional way.
So,
what is the EPRC?
Yeah.
The EPRC is the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which, to be perfectly honest, is something of a clunker, right? It's a little hard to remember. People flip the letters around, right? I do the same thing. I'm a touch dyslexic. But what we're trying to convey is exactly what we are. So emergent, we'll start with that word. So emergent in this case, we're meaning what a lot of people would call spiritual, mystical, magical, energetic, psychedelic phenomena. And there's a wide range of these, from perceptual changes to energetic changes to movements to mood effects to paradigmatic effects, effects related to one's vocation or family or sense of role in society. There are all kinds of strange pains, positive and negative sensations that can arise, capabilities that one can generate in terms of getting into very positive or interesting or spectacular states of mind, being able to perceive things about emotions and the body in very skillful ways or sometimes very challenging ways, and some very weird effects, right? Some that are hard to classify. And so that's what we mean emergent phenomena. And then research, obviously, is trying to figure out how to research these things well, research these things in a way that is very different from most of the research that has come before. Most of the research that has come before has had an agenda, even if it tried to be neutral. Like, this technique is good, or this religious tradition is good, or this thing is bad, or this thing people shouldn't be doing, or whatever it is. They've had some kind of an agenda. And so we are wanting to come in with a very clean sense of research, of doing something very neutral and being able to highlight the good, the bad, the strange, the things that are hard to classify, the things that might have both good and bad elements, or elements that some people might think are good and other people think are bad. And we just need to be open about what those are and bring those forward in a very transparent way. And then consortium means we're a big group of people banded together to do this thing. And from a lot of institutions, from a lot of disciplines, it's now approximately a 100-person group, counting all the people that we have in the EPRC. That's exciting, and it's growing by the week, basically. People show up, and they're really excited about the project and understand the value of it. And then we've got the charity Emergence Benefactors, which is the incorporated 501c3, registered, audited, board regulated with lots of bylaws and policies and protocols and bank accounts and auditing and all of that stuff, that is designed to support the EPRC and all of the other players in the space, like the Quality Research Institute, like ASSIST, like some of these other projects and groups that are affiliated with us, that we have an alliance with, that are very much in the space, and to try to figure out how all of these groups and institutions and research departments can work together in a coordinated way to really accomplish the mission of the EPRC, which is to bring a sense of upgraded clinical competency to the clinical mainstream, to emergency medicine, emergency psychiatry, to mainstream mental health professions, to neurology, to general practitioners, as well as to the public, to get them an increased, sophisticated understanding of the range of these phenomena and what they can do in terms of their positives, their negatives, and just what might be possible in human consciousness. And its full mental health implications, its full vocational implications, and just what in the world is going on, right? For those who have a real curiosity of what are these things, right? And how can we have more of the ones we like and less of the ones we don't?
Wow. So that's exciting.
Thank you.
Now, if you had a Venn diagram of 3 different disciplines or areas that you're bringing together, I'm imagining healthcare is one of those.
Mm-hmm.
Science.
Yep.
And what you would call spirituality?
What a lot of people call spirituality, although it's funny, we have to talk about that word. And the reason we're using the word emergence rather than spirituality is that to say something is spiritual is in some ways an ontological overlay. And a lot of my clinical colleagues, for example, don't understand why someone's limbs shaking might be spiritual, even though to a tradition they might say, oh, that's Kundalini, or that's being touched by the spirit, or that's feeling the presence of God, or that's whatever it is. A lot of the scientific community doesn't entirely understand why seeing a bright white light might be spiritual, or why feeling bliss might be spiritual, right? And so by calling things emergent, what we're recognizing is the need to use very neutral language, right? Because we're not trying to say this is or isn't spiritual. We're just giving the optionality to use very neutral language and clinical language that we hope will allow the work of the EPRC to scale globally and reach all of the people that it needs to reach, which is everybody from our point of view, fulfilling the criteria of justice and equity in clinical care. This is incredibly exciting for us at the EPRC because we hope to answer questions that have been asked for thousands of years and debates that have split whole traditions on the range of what actually happens in humanity and how can science lend hopefully a very neutral, thoughtful, curious lens to trying to figure out what is even possible in human development, what is even possible in terms of the beneficial upgrades of consciousness, and what are the challenges to doing that, and how can we overcome them, and what are the various ways that the traditions have managed to overcome them, both the very old and the very new.
like from the most traditional to the most sort of fusion hybrid traditions and other contemporary brain hacking technologies, and consciousness upgrade technologies, and to really see what are is the range of possibility. That's what we're most excited about. And so this we think is fundamental, groundbreaking human research that explores some of the deepest issues that have ever, the deepest questions that have ever been raised by philosophy, by religious and spiritual practices, and by science, by psychology, and even by clinical medicine. I think one of the exciting things about the clinical perspective is it allows you to manage stuff when you don't know what it is. We don't really know what migraines are, and they do all this weird stuff, but we know a lot about how to manage them, right? And so, you can diagnose something that you've never had, and, I've never had a migraine that I know of, or all the other weird things like Lyme disease, all the weird ways it can present, or some of the strange ones like Kawasaki's, all these odd atypical presentations, or lupus, And the interesting thing is, clinically, we don't have to fully understand what these things are or how they do what they do in order to actually add value to care. And so it may be a while before we really understand what a lot of these emergent phenomena are, at least at the biochemical level. Now, the whole question of how consciousness relates to biology, and that's a whole nother topic. But curiously enough, we don't think you need to answer that actually to add a lot of value to care. Right? So a lot of consciousness research and research in this domain doesn't have that kind of pragmatic clinical focus. But we're very interested in what things are to the degree that it helps us figure out how to have people be okay, right? And that's that clinical focus that allows us to do things where we can be comfortable in mystery, because a lot of clinical stuff is kind of mysterious to us, right? And so by remembering that and thinking, oh, we don't have to know what all of these things are in order to do something good, right? That's the important thing about clinical medicine, right? Because we're already used to that. And we're already used to weird states of mind. Like in an ER, you see a lot of people in very strange states of mind. And then you just ask, what adds value to care? What really helps them? What do they need today? How can I make a difference in this person's life with the resources and understandings that we have? And so that clinical perspective actually cuts through a lot of the problems and lets you do something useful now, even if you don't understand all of the underlying mechanisms. Because we don't know what energy, these energetic experiences, we don't know what they are.
And the idea is not to go create an entire religion around what that even is. It's not the question.
Right. The question is, how do we do something useful for patients and practitioners?
And expand the toolkit for when patients are presenting with different phenomena.
Absolutely. That's it.
So I'm curious about at the time that you spent as an ER doctor and what you noticed as some of the problems and the limitations that you were hitting upon that served as part of your motivation into this.
For almost 2 decades, I basically lived in 2 worlds. And the one world is the world of mainstream clinical medicine, where we were diagnosing mental illness by the DSM, and the options we had in terms of diagnostic codes were dictated largely by ICD-10, which comes out of the World Health Organization. The other part of me that was not going through the mainstream medical system was also exploring the depths of meditation. And so I was also going on intensive retreats. I was hanging out with a lot of people who were exploring all kinds of modalities of ways to change the way they perceive reality, all essentially with the goals of doing something beneficial for themselves, of somehow upgrading their consciousness or their ability to perceive things, or the way they related to their emotions or their bodies or society, or the very fundamental questions of existence themselves. And so this other side of me was noticing that almost none of that is well described in medical school education, in the textbooks of emergency medicine or emergency psychiatry. And that was true 20 years ago, and it's true today. So unfortunately, the understanding of these things is still incredibly limited, despite the fact that meditation and psychedelics and what we're going to call emergent practices are scaling dramatically, and yet the clinical understanding of them is not scaling at all. Of the 70,000 plus diagnostic codes in the ICD-10, there are almost, well, I'd say almost none that relate to emergent phenomena, right? So there's essentially nothing useful from my point of view in the current textbooks of emergency medicine, of emergency psychiatry. There's almost nothing useful in the DSM when it comes to most of this. And this is published by the APA, or American Psychiatric Association. And this is a professional organization that has published now 5 versions of this. And each of them has iterated on the one before. And in the early 90s, they managed to get into it some criteria which I call the spiritual exemption criteria. And this was done by the remarkable doctors Lukoff, Liu, and Turner. And they got in maybe 1% of what they wanted to get in. And what they wanted to get in was a relatively comprehensive appreciation of emergent phenomena. Unfortunately, the only thing they were able to get in, which is still an amazing thing to have done, is what I call the spiritual exemption criteria, which basically say, and I'm summarizing something that's more complicated, but that if you're having experiences that are considered normal within your spiritual or cultural religious tradition, then if you're otherwise functional, if these aren't interfering with your life, then perhaps that is not mental illness. And this applies to things like delusions, hallucinations, maybe even psychosis, depending on how one might want to play that. The problem is the code for this, which is related to religious experience or religious problem, is what's called a modifier code. And so you can't actually bill for a modifier code. You have to have a primary diagnosis. And so what they didn't allow are easy primary diagnoses that are non-pathological, that allow any possibility that these sorts of experiences might have benefit or be neutral or just be strange, but without actually causing harm. And so while some can be challenging, the DSM is very limited in terms of the relationship between the diagnostic codes you're allowed and the range of what might actually be happening. And so being able to improve the DSM in ways that allow clinicians a greater range of nuanced diagnoses that more closely reflect what is going on with patients could be of great value.
And why do you imagine that silo happened? Why is it so isolated?
Yeah, the history of this is really interesting. And so the history of this is that for a long time, religious experiences were actually considered normal in the West. And in the East, they were pretty much always considered normal until recently, when colonialism came to the East and a bunch of Asian countries. And the colonial mindset at the time was beginning to be influenced by secular humanism, by a variance of Protestantism that did not embrace the wide range of, say, Christian mystical experiences that had happened in both Protestants and Catholics and other strains, or Orthodox traditions, Russian, Greek Orthodox, etc. And this sense of scientific materialism that had really come in from the Age of Enlightenment, and which is ironically named, and come out of people such as Isaac Newton, who actually was a practicing alchemist, and by the way also was into mathematics and physics. And curiously enough, out of this alchemist came a tradition that had an extremely limited understanding of the wide range of religious experience. Modern psychiatry, which came up in the 1800s, was highly influenced by all of the notions that came out of the sort of clockwork universe, that it behaved according to laws, that the soul did not exist, that all religious experiences essentially were some sort of psychosis or delusion or hallucination, that not only was there no ontological validity in any of that, but that all of those were pathological, and that with the exception of potentially people in a far distant past, there were no transformative experiences today that could be considered as valuable, as worthwhile, as worth cultivating, as acceptable to mainstream society, to mainstream clinical medicine. And while there were some benefits that came out of that point of view, it wasn't entirely without its uses, it also ends up being extremely constraining when you have a population where large numbers of people are now doing the practices and taking the substances and engaging in lifestyles that lead to these phenomena. For example, when I was a teenager, I loved flying dreams. I've been having flying dreams since I was a kid, and they were just delightful. And I had a course in 4th grade where they taught us some basic meditation techniques, the kind of thing where you like squeeze your toes and then relax them and feel the golden healing energy coming in, then squeeze your feet and squeeze your legs, and progressive relaxation techniques. This is pretty simple, fun stuff. And a little bit of creative visualization where we would visualize ourselves getting really small and exploring our bodies and fixing little things that needed to be fixed, or getting really big, getting as big as the school, as big as the town, as big as the state, the country, the planet, the solar system, the universe, bigger than the universe. And so I started visualizing when I was about 14 or 15. I have no idea why I started doing this, visualizing having flying dreams and practicing flying around. And if you've ever tried to visualize, you probably notice it's hard work. And it takes a lot of concentration to actually get good images. And so, but I was working really hard and really enthused about this. And before I knew it, I found myself in real meditation territory, and my body exploded like a fireworks display, and I traveled out of my body for the first time. And I started having energetic phenomena, sometimes odd twitching movements or feelings of tingling or energy moving through my body. One time I became an energy vortex, it felt like, of rapture and bliss while dancing in a club, not on any substances or anything, just dancing around while I was running sound for a band. So I was actually a sound man that would sometimes dance when I was working. And these experiences were happening to me, but I had no frameworks for them. I didn't know what they were. I didn't have any basket to put them in. My parents would not have understood them had I told them about them. It's pretty much guaranteed that had I told a pediatrician or a neurologist about any of this, who knows what their diagnosis would have been, but it almost certainly would not have been something good. Now, these were confusing experiences for me as a teenager, but ultimately I found a meditation tradition, and there are a bunch of these, I just happened to find one, that had mapped these well, that knew what to do with them, that considered them stock and standard, that was able to allow me to figure out how to turn them into really positive transformations of consciousness that ended up being the things in my life that I'm the most grateful for. And so what started out as strange and confusing experiences, it turns out, were potentially extremely transformative. Although at the time, they could be quite odd and sometimes confusing and even a little bit destabilizing, but ultimately the outcomes were really good. And the problem is, this is not an understanding that the clinical mainstream has. As my kind father, who's a very well-trained physician, later said, yeah, had you told me about those, I would not have known what they were. But now he has some appreciation that this might just be part of standard human development for some people, not everybody necessarily, we don't know, but that it's part of the range of what can happen and may lead to beneficial things, even if the short to medium term can sometimes be strange, destabilizing, challenging, confusing, etc.
In a sense, you had nowhere to go. You had no one to talk to. And the medical systems actually, because they couldn't recognize and identify what you were going through, weren't offering you solutions or support in a way that could actually expand you as a human.
Right. And when those transformative technologies have existed in various cultures and a wide range of traditions for thousands of years. So there's plenty of evidence from the texts and even living traditions today that there are lots of techniques that lead to these effects, and that these are some of the most valued effects of whole religions and whole cultures that intentionally cultivate these because they consider them of tremendous value and sometimes even of the highest value. And the history of the West and Western philosophy has been highly shaped by people who cultivated these experiences, going back from the Greek mystery schools and before in the West to the Catholic mystics and other non-aligned mystics, and actually plenty of Islamic mystics, Jewish mystics, had tremendous influence on Western thought, on mathematics, on architecture, on philosophy, and science, as well as literature. So Tolstoy, for example, who had a bunch of these experiences. T.S. Eliot, another great example. Einstein had experiences like this. René Descartes is a classic example of someone who describes in very vividly, very classic, what we're calling emergent phenomena or emergent experiences. And so these have actually been very much a part of the transformative history of even Western culture, where we often think of them as more associated with Eastern geographies or traditions. So, for example, William James, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, wrote about these issues, and he wrote about a tremendous number of these phenomena, and he wrote about ontological ways of viewing them, and he was a Harvard psychiatrist, so he was mainstream, as mainstream as it gets, and yet he appreciated that there was this range, and yet his incredible work got ignored. So many people reference it, and yet there's no obvious evidence of any clinical incorporation of it. And what's interesting is he talks a lot about the twice born, and he talks a lot about people who've had conversion experiences into their religions, religious ecstatic experiences, people who have been touched by the Spirit, as they may have called it. And so what's interesting is this hints at a way that nearly all of the religious traditions can agree on, is that these powerful experiences, that these amazing transformative traditions can create, need a place in the clinical mainstream, need a way to be recognized as sometimes being the incredibly valuable things that they are. You know, going back to experiences like that of St. Paul's reported in the Bible, for example. This transformative experience was never the same again. And plenty of people report these experiences today, and yet very reasonably, they're unlikely to tell their mainstream healthcare provider, even if this might be one of the most important experiences of their entire life. We think that this is actually a social justice issue. So social justice would dictate that people who are having health problems related to this or unfortunate outcomes, or who are having amazing things happen to them, and it would be great if that could happen to other people, right, who would really benefit from those things happening. This is a highly neglected area of research. When we know from the thousands of online forum posts you can find about this, from the thousands of tweets you can find about this, from the countless tens of thousands of people who are doing these practices that lead to this, from the many, many thousands, perhaps millions of people who do psychedelics, right? We know that people out there are having these experiences because you can find abundant evidence of it, and yet to have almost no research funding, this is ridiculous from our point of view. There are rare diseases that 20 people in the world have ever been documented to have that have gotten more research funding and interest than this. And yet this is fundamental to human creativity, to society, it's the foundation of all of our religious and spiritual traditions, is these emergent phenomena. And yet it has received an extraordinarily small amount of research money that would actually allow it to scale globally in terms of a real discussion of how best to care for these and to cultivate the positives. So we've got studies going that right now that are in progress that we've already found the money for that relate to people who have these extraordinary abilities to shift into and out of various states of mind, including shifting into very negative states of mind and then shifting out of them within seconds to incredibly positive states of mind, right, with a high degree of control and precision. That, from the point of view of someone who is, having chronic anxiety or depression, is a superpower, right? But these are learnable skill sets with technologies that have existed for thousands of years, well documented, where you can train people to do this, right? And this is incredibly exciting, but it's also absurd that it's been neglected for so long, that people have been writing about this, practicing this, figuring out how to do this for themselves. And yet that kind of technology is not available broadly in the clinical mainstream for people who are struggling with various mental health conditions, when there's no reason it couldn't be. And so what is a way that we can take all of those technologies, see what is underlying them, compare them to modern technologies and frameworks of thinking about these, get a sense of what is the underlying neurophysiology, the underlying biochemistry, and their psychological effects, their physical effects, their social effects, their paradigmatic transformation potentials, both good, bad, and strange, and be able to have an honest dialogue about these things and say what's good, what's not good, what are good ways to cultivate things that meet with people's risk tolerance profiles, what are ways to avoid some of the challenging things that patients or practitioners may not want, and then figure out how to bring that knowledge to the world.
Wow. So let's say this happens. Can you describe, the short vision and then a 10-year vision and even 100 years or 1,000 years out?
Yeah, so the really short vision is we're starting with something we call the Expert Opinion Project, where it's looking at all of the people we can find who are experts in this now. So if you look at various levels of evidence quality, usually you move from individual case reports to case series to expert opinion about how to handle these cases and something about the underlying physiology, hopefully, and then bigger, hopefully prospective trials of management if you're talking about the challenging phenomena, or cultivation if you're talking about the positive phenomena, and then to turn that by moving up the stages of evidence quality into broad clinical recommendations that are well supported. And so we do not have the longitudinal clinical trials, but what we do have is a substantial body of people who have been working with what we're calling emergent phenomena. They would almost all call it something else, but they've been working with this for decades, and people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, who have been, in the field, in the trenches experts of handling this within their own traditions and frameworks. And one of the first things we want to do is interview a whole bunch of them about their best categorization strategies, diagnostic strategies, what kind of phenomena they see, how they think is the best way to cultivate the positive ones that people want. And there might be some disagreement between people about which ones are the positive ones and the more challenging ones. But then to be able to take those recommendations and see what are the areas of consensus, like for handling peak experiences, like the spiritual highs. What are the ways that people help people to deal with those well, or real spiritual lows, if you want to call them that, which might be called things like dark nights or knowledges of suffering, or the archetypal journey into the underworld, however you want to think about this, shamanic crisis, lots of shadows, right? The challenging stuff, the deep dives into the aspects of ourselves and the range of human experience that might be very challenging for many people, how to relate to those in a way that meets people's needs.
Even grief.
Absolutely, definitely grief. And so then the goal is then to take these expert opinions and see what the areas of consensus are, and also see where are the areas of significant disagreement, particularly if black and white opinions, no, we should do it this way, no, we should do it 100% opposite the other way. Those then may be the basis of prospective clinical trials where we can actually compare diagnostic and management strategies. And what we then hope to see is, if we can do large enough trials, is actually to get to what we really care about, which is ethics, because the entire project is grounded in ethics.
I have so many questions. So just on the note of ethics, since you just got us to that point, what is ethics in this context? How do you define that?
So medical ethics, in this case, has four main principles. And the first one is that we value patient autonomy. And for a patient or a practitioner or just a member of the public to have proper autonomy, they have to have good information on which to act. And so, in theory, medical ethics demands that for anything you're doing, which might include a diagnostic strategy, a management strategy, a cultivation strategy, or something else, like even an underlying framework, like an ontology, where you say scientific materialism is true or scientific materialism is not true, then you should be able to discuss the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives of each of those strategies and be able to compare them such that a patient, or if they're incapacitated, their family member or guardian or whoever has authority to make decisions in their case, can make an informed decision. And obviously, informed decisions are hard to perfectly make because even a theoretical understanding is not the same as a personal understanding. And the meaning of words can be unclear, and there are tremendous problems when it comes to attempting to inform people in a way that allows them to give proper informed consent. However, you can at least try. And currently, there's really no training in how to give informed consent for the range of diagnostic and management strategies when it comes to emergent phenomena. There is nothing about that in medical textbooks or mainstream medical training or mental health training, unless you're going to, say, the transpersonal literature, which we'll talk about. But at the moment, we cannot at all meet the basic criteria of patient autonomy and informed consent. Because what we really have is a system that says there's only one ontology. We've decided for you, the patient or practitioner or the public, that this is the ontology, basically the medical model of disease that said it's all basically dopamine and serotonin plus minus a bit of trauma, and the rest is all delusion and hallucination and psychosis and conversion disorder, and none of it is real or valuable or valid. And the treatment in nearly all cases, if it's not going to be something like CBT, is going to be medications. And that's pretty much what's on the menu. Now, as meditation begins to move in to the world of, oh, maybe we can handle some of this through mindfulness, which is really cool. I think that's a really great step. The problem is that, as the old books that all of the techniques of mindfulness came out of will tell you, the range of emergent phenomena that can arise from mindfulness is huge. All this mood stuff and perceptual stuff and what people would call hallucinations or delusions and what we might call things like kriyas or spontaneous movements or perceptual transformations or even fundamental transformations of one's sense of oneself, right? So most of the mindfulness techniques came straight out of Buddhism, which is designed to get you to realize that you don't exist as a stable, permanent, coherent entity. Well, that is very much antithetical to the primary goals of most of Western psychiatry, which is to give you a sense of being a stable, permanent entity that's in control, right?
Yeah. So, and what you're speaking to is not necessarily replacing an ontology, but creating more fluidity between ontologies and being able to shift those around. So it's like something is emerging and it's the unknown, it's coming through, right? And then it's met with this medical pre-existing ontology. So to create some flexibility in the systems that we're in.
Right. And good clinicians already have some sense of this. The placebo effect has an appreciation of this, that there are different ways to look at problems and situations and what we think of as the underlying realities of those that can lead to workability in situations. And one framework may not be optimal for a certain set of goals for all problems. And so in this realm, what we hope to add is a formal, not only something of an ontological ability to be either agnostic or to have a meta-paradigmatic, meta-ontological fluency. There's a bunch of fancy words that essentially allows you to compare your ontologies on the fly. If I assume scientific materialism, what are the pros and cons of that? What are the risks, benefits, and alternatives? What have I done when I do that? Well, I can tell you one of the things you've done is you've alienated basically every religion. So straight out of the gate, anybody who's religious, you've alienated them. You've created some distance, which can interfere with clinical care, as anybody who's ever tried to work in a tradition or belief system or with patients that have a different belief system, if you meet them with a strong statement of a belief system they don't like, it creates barriers to care. And what we really care about more than enforcing an ontology or a statement about what is truly true, what we really care about is good patient outcomes. But sometimes clinicians and healthcare systems and governments and whole philosophies or whole academic traditions will take as their primary goal the enforcement of an ontology or a worldview instead of caring about autonomy, patients making decisions about what is valuable and important for them, and caring about good clinical outcomes, which may be as defined by the patients and or their families or caregivers, et cetera, as by you, and really should be ultimately defined by them if we're going to meet the criteria of medical ethics. And this is where it gets complicated, because the equation was basically, wait, but if you're outside of this narrow range of states of mind and experiences, then you're crazy. And once you're crazy, we can take away patient choice. And that, I think, the mainstream does with too much regularity from my point of view, and I could be wrong. We'll see what the clinical outcome data shows. I'm willing to subject this to science. But to say that really we should be thinking about what is the maximum amount of autonomy that we can give to patients and decision makers, such as their caregivers or their parents. And what we're not doing is that a lot of the time if people get out of this very narrow range. And so it's a circular argument where if you get out of the narrow range, then you no longer should have autonomy. They can force hospitalize people, they can force medicate them, they can give them diagnoses that say you're broken for life, diagnoses that are basically a lifelong diagnosis like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. The going thinking is generally if you have these, you have them, and you will have them for the rest of your life, meaning you will need to be on medications for the rest of your life. When I know a number of people who got into what I would think of as emergent phenomena through various practices, and instead of staying that way when the emergent phenomena ended or transformed into something else, suddenly they didn't meet any criteria for schizophrenia or bipolar. So they had clearly been misdiagnosed. And so that's the kind of thing where I feel really bad for my clinician friends who don't have access to this kind of information. They don't have good data. They don't have expertise in emergent phenomena. And they all generally went into clinical care because they wanted to know stuff and help people, right? But they don't. And so when it comes to this stuff, and so instead they have a lack of knowledge, and I think that sometimes leads to harm or suboptimal care.
So how do you describe how this level of sophistication or attunement or paradigmatic fluidity, how do you describe how this could actually be scaled and people could learn how to actually embrace this?
So there are a lot of simple things we think people could do, like basic grounding techniques for spiritual highs, for example. There are dietary techniques, there are exercise techniques, there are cognitive techniques, there are distraction techniques. There are all these things that many meditation teachers and people in shamanic ceremonies, etc., already do now. Listening to them, calming voices, there are various modalities. And so changing the lighting, music, etc. These are relatively simple things, but they are not mainstream clinical care. And yet we think there's a possibility that if we do the studies, that it may show that these are more effective than a harshly lit fluorescent room and aggressive security staff and a somewhat jarring environment might lead to better outcomes. It's a reasonable hypothesis, and it's a hypothesis that needs good testing. And if it shows up to have benefit over good, when it's tested in prospective comparative clinical trials, then if it's adopted, that's a relatively simple strategy that could be adopted, incorporated into medical education, incorporated into textbooks, incorporated into continuing medical education modules, incorporated into health system policy, and even be reimbursable. And so that's a simple example of something that may lead to some better outcomes. Or another example, if people are in what we might call the challenging territory, which might go by names like knowledges of suffering or a dark night or a spiritual crisis or something like that. And if, some of these very confusing experiences that can involve a lot of fear or disorientation or sense of depersonalization or derealization or profound irritation or a sense of sudden disgust with one's life or job or partner or situation. And these can be very challenging, but we hypothesize, for example, that perhaps it has something to do with the default mode network. And maybe we can test if there are techniques to deactivate or downregulate the default mode network. Perhaps that would have some ability to bring the person just into the present, into the body, into the space. So, for example, the SEMA lab is looking at ultrasound technology, which can modulate some of the brain centers related to the default mode network. And then there are other people who are looking at using fMRI or EEG feedback to allow increased activation of frontal lobes and executive decision centers and downregulation of the default mode network, which can lead to, when you have a highly upregulated default mode network, it can lead to rumination, depression, anxiety, being lost in one's darkness, as it were. Whereas there seem to be technologies that are still being tested and developed where you can get people to downregulate the default mode network and increase their frontal executive centers and consequently feel better and have more emotional and functional regulation of their situation and be able to make better decisions in the face of their experiences. And so these are relatively straightforward, actually, technologies, even though they sound kind of fancy. And these are things that we think we can do clinically and have evidence that can be done clinically. And so these might be important therapeutic adjuncts or even primary therapies for people who are entering into some of this challenging territory.
So one thing I understand that you were speaking to previously was about having people be able to share their direct experience. Having someone be able to share something prior to making meaning of it and not making meaning as they're sharing it, but just actually dealing with the emergent phenomena as it's described in direct experience. So how could this serve?
Yeah, so curiously enough, the clinical perspective that has brought us to the situation where religion and the clinical world are in some ways at odds structurally. Oddly enough, the clinical perspective that can also deal with things in the realm of symptoms, I think, provides a global scaling solution. So if you just look at, say, okay, they were feeling a shuddering, a bright white light, a sense of expanding unitive consciousness, those are things you can just describe. And then there are probably not many biochemical pathways that can happen by. There's probably only a few, and maybe even just one. So it might have a straightforward neurological basis. It might be something that can be managed in straightforward ways that don't require saying, well, this was this opening or that opening, or from divine grace, or from whatever. And instead, the clinical point of view allows you to stick to the level of phenomenology, which in this case might be thought of as symptomatology, signs and symptoms, and then you can come up with straightforward descriptions that then allow a straightforward management course. And if you then don't go to the level of ontologies and say, well, this is, purely something you're making up in conversion disorder, or this is something that is, the divine love of God pouring through you or whatever, then you allow it to scale to all these situations and settings and countries and where they may add their own meaning to it. Or patients coming from a specific religious or philosophical tradition may add their own meaning to it, but you're leaving that door open for them and not taking up that space in a way that does not help. And so what you're doing then is focusing on outcomes rather than on imposed ontologies, and really focusing on what scales globally rather than focusing on your sort of ontological hegemony or supremacy.
And it's like that, the way things are presenting can be very unique and different for everyone. And also there's patterns. There's real patterns happening that you've experienced in your meditation and the people that you've been working with in meditation, is that actually there is a sequence that the body goes through.
Yeah, so there are many, many maps of spiritual progress and terrain that are out there across the traditions, and they're fascinating. I've been something of an obsessive student of the maps of meditation for 2.5 decades now, about half my life, and exploring them and seeing how the techniques might be replicable in terms of leading to the effects that they promise in old textbooks, and seeing really what can be done and what can we do to enhance our consciousness, our perception of our emotions, of our experience, of our bodies, of other people, of our interactions. And the interesting thing is, if you take a whole bunch of people and you put them on like an intensive meditation retreat, you will actually see a bunch of them go through very similar progressions, which is what, the curiously replicable aspect of that appeals to the scientist in me, but also the clinician in me looks at that and go, that's interesting. You could possibly see, oh wait, someone is at this stage. And so that's why they're having this experience. And it gives a range of possible explanations that may lead to workable solutions. Because for thousands of years, plenty of traditions have been trying to figure out how to cultivate the good and what even is the good, and how to deal with the challenging things that can arise that have also been described across traditions for thousands of years. And those technologies need to be brought into the clinical realm, the scientific realm, and compared head to head. An analogy I use a lot is mixed martial arts. So before mixed martial arts, karate and kung fu and jujitsu, they all thought they were the best, right? And then it turns out, no, mixed martial arts is the best. Period. And it's a pragmatic mix of the cool elements that seem to just work in an actual fight, from each of the various traditions. And so in the same kind of way, we can see what the meditation traditions and the psychedelic traditions, the shamanic traditions, the religious traditions have to offer in terms of frameworks, conceptually, in terms of techniques, in terms of helpful things that just lead to people doing better. And so in that kind of way, hopefully, we can lend the benefits of science, which traditionally has in many ways, because of scientific materialism, been opposed to all of that. Instead, we think science is going to have a lot pragmatically and practically to say about all of that really can help people.
So in all of these different systems coming together, where does this trickle down into equity?
Equity is actually one of the key points. So that's one of the other pillars of medical ethics. So if the first one is patient autonomy, the second one is beneficence, which is knowing enough to be able to add value to care, right? Knowing things that allow you to do good. And then there's the next one, which is non-malfeasance, which is knowing how to avoid doing harm, right? Knowing enough to not do harm and to intentionally try to not do harm. And then the last one is justice, which also might be thought of as equity, which is that there would be even access to this across healthcare systems and globally. And currently, the situation is that if you're lucky enough to find someone, a particular religious leader or meditation teacher or shaman or somebody who has a lot of experience with what you're going through, then you may be able to get some advice that has an increased level of efficacy, an increased level of utility. Whereas at the moment, most mainstream mental health providers and clinicians are not trained in the skillful management, cultivation, etc., of emergent phenomena. And so critical to fulfilling the goal of medical ethics is this kind of broad-based, data-driven knowledge. And so the whole of the EPRC project is designed to create the situation in which we meet the fundamental criteria of global equity, of a sophisticated knowledge of these things. It's kind of like people want to make Teslas, but you got to have good roads. And you can really only drive a Tesla where you have roads. And if you had really bad roads or washed out bridges or something, you couldn't drive your Tesla there.
And people want to make the flashy products, the cool new psychedelic, the fancy new molecule, the hip biofeedback technique or whatever that gets people into this territory. But it can go very strangely. As you're rewriting the code while the operating system is still running in your brain or body, heart, mind, body system, then the effects can be pretty odd. And we are essentially trying to fill in that gap where you need not only good roads, but you need good paint so that the roads, have good defined lines so that the auto-driving features can follow the road. And you need good guardrails, and you need good speed limits, and you need good trauma centers where if something does go wrong, we can take care of you. Yeah. And in the same kind of way, since meditation and psychedelics and all these practices are scaling, the EPRC is trying to do the maybe not quite so glamorous work, but utterly important structural, long-term fundamental work that gives the support to all of these amazing emergent technologies of brain hacking, consciousness expansion, whatever it is. But you need a healthcare system that can have a skillful relationship to that, a really sophisticated relationship to that, rather than the current relationship to it, which cannot be described as sophisticated.
So one of the things I find really beautiful about all of this is you're not presenting something that will take away. It's an additive. And so the recognition of when to use certain methodologies or tools is the awareness of when and how to use them in certain settings. So that's the fluidity. So it's a very additive, integrative solution that the consortium is really bringing forward.
Absolutely. So if the thesis was mainstream clinical care, and then the antithesis was sort of the transpersonal literature, which did a lot of amazing things, but was very sort of antithetical, taking that position of rebellion or something against the clinical mainstream. We're trying to look at both of those and just say, yeah, but what leads to good outcomes? When does the clinical, the traditional clinical methods, when do they seem to really work well for people? And when do more alternative methods work well for people? And allowing clinicians and patients to choose and say, hey, this is what seems to do best in this situation, and societies and cultures, and to give them the information they need to make those informed decisions.
What are the other core values that you're building this around?
So other core values are inclusiveness. So by not being wedded to any of the mainstream religions, we have people from an extraordinarily wide range of religions and spiritual traditions. We have some people who think of themselves in some ways as scientific materialists and yet have had these phenomena, don't know what to make of them in that context, but they're like curious at least, right? Cool. That curiosity is the interesting thing. And I myself was actually quite the scientific materialist. I'm not as much of a scientific materialist now. I think I'm much more flexible. But for years, even though I was having these kinds of experiences, which made no sense from a scientific materialist point of view. And so what I think is really interesting is that this diversity allows for a very inclusive conversation. We're just trying to figure out how to get the EPRC on some kind of a functional page involves doing it's a microcosm of what we need to do to scale this globally, right? If to satisfy the needs of all these different disciplines and to keep that curiosity, that open-mindedness, that interest that is science at its best, that is clinical medicine at its best, and spiritual practice at its best, I think. To keep that going, that is the curiosity and that inclusiveness of perspectives and that openness to, how does this work? Yeah. What is that really? And then that leads to a lot of interesting things. Like when you think about how to scale this globally, not only linguistically and anthropologically and economically, but from the point of view of players like the security industry, right? So this is a curious thing, right? We usually don't think of like the security industry, the global military industries or the space industry as having anything to do with this. And yet we think there are security implications to this stuff, right? So we think that there are people who in the heights of their zealousness
or in their spiritual crashes that may happen after the heights of their zealousness, that they may pose security threats to various populations, for example. We know of example of people coming down out of space who had profound emergent experiences, as we would call them. So, for example, Edgar Mitchell, who founded the Institute for Noetic Sciences, because he had a profound transformative experience in space, we think that the space industry needs to know about this stuff. We think that governments need to know about this because, like, let's say one of their generals or someone with authorization to use powerful weaponry, or even a world leader or someone who has tremendous amounts of power got into this territory, then we need to know how to make sure that leads to good outcomes. And so we have an ethical responsibility to society to make sure that we have a thorough understanding of people who are involved in mission-critical applications and who have significant power to disrupt the security status of the world, that they and those who are around them need to have a sophisticated understanding of how to identify and work skillfully with emergent phenomena. And we think those understandings can be upgraded. So imagine if you had someone on a space mission. They're 9 months in space, potentially a very contemplative environment, right? Could easily, very perspective shifting environment, might get into these experiences. And let's say that mission had another 9 months to it. You were going to Mars and back or something. And so you need to have a way to manage this that isn't just shutting them down with antipsychotics or something. So that kind of open-mindedness, where people are often not thinking of these in those kinds of broad practical contexts, and yet the EPRC thinks of itself as going to all those kinds of places.
What do you think are some of the fears and stigmas that have the reasons for the fears and the reasons for the stigmas that have been placed and are carrying with the current view of psychedelics in our modern society?
I think the world of psychedelics is actually ahead of the world of, say, deep meditative experiences, where these are not being studied around the world. There's just a few places that study these, such as the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project at Brown, where they do study some of this stuff, but is considered more controversial, more fringe, doesn't get nearly as much funding or attention. And I think books like How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan just did incredible things for helping people, a wide mainstream audience, to have an appreciation of the pros and cons and alternatives to psychedelics. A long time ago, I hung out a shingle that basically said, I will talk to you about your weird meditative experiences and do that for free. And when I did that, I got to talk to thousands of people over about 2 decades so far, of people who have had these kinds of experiences. And the majority of them used to be just deep dive meditators, people going on meditation retreats, dark retreats, intensive yoga retreats, doing these sorts of intensive traditional contemplative practices that were non-plant medicine based or frog medicine based or synthetic medicine based, that were leading to them getting into what I think of as emergent territory. But for the last, 5 or 10 years, I'd say a third to a half of the people who I've spoken with, psychedelics are some significant part of that mix, and the percentage just keeps going up, particularly as these become legalized or decriminalized in various jurisdictions, as police departments stop prioritizing them in terms of enforcement, and people become more interested in what are these as transformative technologies, as being shown to maybe have impacts on depression, as people are microdosing, as they're using for their anxieties or phobias, or even addiction treatment in the case of things like ibogaine or psilocybin or salvia. Some of these I've heard of people using for that. And so the mainstream psychedelic world, I think, is way ahead of even the deep contemplative world, because you can actually find chapters on psychedelics in the mainstream textbooks of emergency medicine. Not well written, not very sophisticated, but better than nothing,
whereas you can literally find nothing about the well-known effects, at least in the contemplative worlds, of deep, intensive, meditative, spiritual practices. There's nothing at all.
And why do you imagine that's that way?
Yeah, so this is a curious thing, and I think part of that is the boost that psychedelics got in the first wave in the 50s and 60s, when there were thousands of studies and thousands of researchers looking at what psychedelics can do, till it was all shut down under Nixon, when all, the whole scheduling of Schedule I substances and all of these were declared to have no possible therapeutic value and purely harmful, and thus made highly illegal. But before that happened, these got a lot of attention, and that attention lived on in the public consciousness and then in the criminalized, the criminalized substance use world. It's not like people stopped, dropping hits of acid or doing psychedelics. They, of course, continued to do so, other psychedelics. But what happened is it went underground. But in the music and popular culture, it's still obviously very much there. Psychedelic culture was here to stay and continued to evolve and change as new molecules and appreciations came online. And then groups like MAPS. So the EPRC is very much inspired by groups like MAPS. So this is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which started in the mid-'80s and 35 years later is now in clinical trials of MDMA and psilocybin, which are being shown to be beneficial in certain conditions like PTSD and depression and anxiety. And so they've got really like a 3.5-decade head start, which is great, except the medications and substances that they're promoting can lead to emergent phenomena, and their clinicians are utterly unprepared for that. It can lead to deep spiritual territory, and there's nothing in the textbooks to help with that. And so the EPRC project is going to be vital in terms of figuring out how to get ahead of that curve and bring some information into the clinical mainstream that they can use, hopefully, to better manage these patients in a way that is more conducive to good outcomes.
I'm curious about different factors that would go into that limitation for clinicians. And I'm thinking about the incentive structure of the current pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, so the pharmaceutical industry is extremely complicated. So if we get into the pharmaceutical industry, clearly the incentive structures for the pharmaceutical industry are to sell as many expensive medications as possible with the highest profit margins. And it is obviously true that the pharmaceutical industry has created a tremendous amount of utterly world-transforming pharmaceuticals, right? Antibiotics and incredible number of medications that I use as an ER doctor to extremely good effect, save many, many lives through the incredible power of these things. But we also know the incentive structure is definitely to maximize medication use and expenditures. And so having non-pharmacological interventions potentially for some of these conditions may meet with some economic resistance. And so thinking about the economics in the space and what are the incentive structures is definitely something we're going to have to do, and to show that, if we can figure out ways to manage some of the challenging emergent phenomena without medications or through using traditional techniques or new techniques or hybrids or biofeedback or methods that come out of further understanding of the neurochemistry, then there will be competition in the space for management dollars. That's definitely true, which brings us to the whole business side of the thing, which is that from a business point of view, this has to make economic sense. So any solution that's going to scale to national health services needs to make economic sense to those national health services. It needs to make economic sense to the clinicians in the field. There needs to be reimbursement for this stuff. It needs to make economic sense for patients, for hospitals, for insurance companies. It needs to make economic sense, or else you will meet with resistance from extremely large players. And so the question is that the EPRC needs to answer through doing the science is, what are the economic synergies where it really is a win-win-win for all the key players involved? And those are the things we think are likely to be adopted in terms of mainstream healthcare practices.
What is an example of some of those?
So, for example, the world of festival psychedelic care is really interesting. So you have groups like the Zendo Project out of MAPS, which go to festivals such as Burning Man, et cetera, and provide festival care for people who are having what we would think of as emergent crisis. So you might be from psychedelics, it might be from some powerful dancing ceremony, it might be from a sweat lodge, it might be from sleep deprivation in a hyperstimulating environment, it might be happening for other reasons, who knows. But if you compare what they do to what's done in a typical emergency department is going to be loud, challenging, bright lights, not conducive to a more calm, contemplative experience. And we want to do trials that basically compare this sort of festival style of care, which is very holistic, very patient accommodating, very non-pathologizing if they can help it, trying to avoid medications for calming people down if they can, and still have everybody be safe. And that is coming at this from a real point of view of the whole person and their experience being respected, potentially normalized, and held in a space that might be much more conducive to this resolving well without medications, and potentially even leading to positive transformations in a way that, say, the typical emergency department setting may not be. Now, having worked in emergency departments, I understand why they are the way they are. But the question is, are there reasonable alternatives when we could discuss the risks, benefits, and alternatives of a care strategy like that, and trying to actively compare some of these modalities in terms of their approach to the patient and their approach to their friends and their family and to the whole situation and the way they conceptualize it and manage it, and to see what the outcomes are and to see which patients prefer and to see what families prefer and to see then what are the longer term implications of having been managed one way versus the other way. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So there was someone I know. I got contacted by his girlfriend, actually, and he sat down for his first meditation sit. And he decided to sit for an hour. And within the first few minutes, a powerful column of energy started moving up his spine. When it hit his head, it started radiating out in waves of unitive, divine, blissful suchness, or something like that, and came down about 7 days later with the help of his friends and people looking on Google as how do you handle this stuff, and thinking, oh, maybe this is a Kundalini awakening or energetic opening or something like that, and managed to get him to come down, and he did fine. So they were looking at it through an energetic lens, through a spiritual lens, a meditative lens, and that's obviously a non-pharmacological lens most of the time, and the outcome was fine. But the mainstream lens would have been, this is a manic episode with religious delusions and or some sort of temporal lobe seizure and or some other sort of thing, even though it seemed like a classic, straightforward opening of the kind that you routinely see on meditation retreats somewhere 6 to 10 days in, and some people can get into on psychedelics or through other processes, Kundalini, yoga, etc. And so rather than looking at through the clinical frame, the spiritual frame allowed them to apply a different set of technologies that led to a different outcome, rather than, say, forced hospitalization and forced medication and giving somebody a permanently stigmatizing diagnosis and taking away rights, when perhaps that wasn't what was needed to happen. And so those are the kinds of trials we need to conduct of what are the people that you can actually manage in this kind of a way, and what are the benefits and risks of doing that versus the other way. And in terms of longitudinal outcomes, not just in the short term, but in the medium to long term, and in terms of how patients think of themselves, how families think of them, how jobs and bosses and their careers, how all of them think of this and relate to them. Because when you tell someone they're broken for life, that can have its own set of consequences, rather than framing something of, hey, this is the beginning of a journey that might be very positive, and we need to do the science to just compare those two ways of looking at it, rather than the mainstream medical system essentially just making the decision, we have the answer, it's the only answer, and we have the right to impose this on you regardless of you or your family's views.
So in that process, I'm just imagining the territory of coming across the challenge of linguistics. So what is the approach that you're taking with that?
Yeah, so the linguistic challenges are huge, right? That's because if we get the language wrong and people start digging in about the language, because people can become very attached to language, then we're going to alienate every tradition that doesn't like that language. And that could be billions of people. So billions of people around the globe identify with various religious traditions, and coming up with very neutral clinical language that we may need to invent a whole new lexicon. So for example, the transpersonal literature has a whole lexicon for dealing with a lot of emergent phenomena, but it doesn't scale globally because it's insufficiently technical rather than borrowing language from very specific religious traditions and ontological assumptions. And so while really interesting and potentially very beneficial, still doesn't scale and get to all the places that we hope to get our solutions to. And so that's one of the things I'm worried about is when everybody thinks about that challenge, we're going to need some very smart, sophisticated people to help us navigate that politics.
It's interesting because it does seem like that's right at the heart of where emergent phenomena meets the baggage of a word that is associated inside the system with a previous belief system. So it's like as soon as a word is heard, then everything that's preconceived comes out first. So these words pack a punch and they carry a lot of weight. And you never really know culturally which one is going to land in what way oftentimes. Right. So yeah, that sounds like a really big undertaking.
Yeah, so we're going to need a bunch of professional medical linguists, and people have deep understandings, of the weight behind words.
And inversely, how powerful they can be when actually they land in a precise way, and it's something that is feeling heard and feeling seen in an accuracy of what someone's going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And linguistically, I'm incredibly jealous of chemistry, for example, where carbon is just carbon, of mathematics, of taxonomy, where a plant species just has a name. And there was a time when debating what name a plant species would get was a big deal, right? 1800s, there were all these debates about taxonomy. It was very exciting times. But that's kind of done now. There's still new things discovered and new taxonomies, and I'm sure somebody is still arguing about what you should call something. But most of the species that we know of, they're described and they just have a name. And so in that same kind of way, or mathematical symbolism and notation is standardized the world over. I'm incredibly jealous of the state of the art of those kinds of things. And I look forward to the clinical version of that for emergent phenomena. That's what I'm very excited about. And given that they did it for all these other domains of human activity, I think this can be done for emergent phenomena in the same kind of way.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And also part of the systems you're describing now, what comes up for me is just imagining how there's not a hierarchy. There's not a this is better than that or worse than that. It's just that this is what this is. There's a simplicity to that. And it's not comparing them in a way that something has better or worse.
Right. Yeah, it's just really what will lead to a functional system. That's what's most important to me.
Yeah, and when someone's going through something and how their body and mind and psyche is presenting, to be able to meet that with that simplicity.
And then leaving the space for the religious traditions and the cultures and other groups to add their own meaning to it.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And not adding meaning or enforced meaning overlay when it isn't needed and may even interfere with care, but also allowing the possibility of comparative meaning analysis. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. It may be that you can compare meanings and see what outcomes they lead to, right? Compare if you add this meaning overlay, these are the outcomes you would expect. And if you add this meaning overlay, these are the outcomes you would expect in various populations. And this is a level of sophistication that I think will really benefit societies in general. And again, good clinicians already do this. Good clinicians can flex with their patients into the patient's sphere of meaning and work with them in a way that leads to healing. So what we're trying to do is bring that level of sophistication that we see in some of the best clinicians who deal with emergent phenomena to the other clinicians who haven't been trained or introduced to those kinds of options. I was talking with a senior meditation teacher who had taught at a major meditation center for 15 years, people doing deep spiritual practice. And she admitted, we're scared when we have to finally admit we don't have the resources to handle somebody who the extreme end of emergent phenomena, which are not that common, we don't know, we don't have good population-based data, but they happen. And, they said it was a nightmare thinking about sending them into the hands of the clinical mainstream. My colleagues in medicine don't want to be thought of as nightmares. They want to be thought of as knights in shining armor, right? People who really help, people who need help. And instead, here they are being viewed as something frightening or dangerous. That's not cool, right? And my heart goes out to my colleagues in the trenches. I want to help them. I want to figure out how to get the tools in their hands that they need to handle what is happening now and what will be coming as more and more people get into the practices and take the substances and find themselves in this territory. For all of the people involved in that, for all of the hospital systems, for the healthcare networks, for the law enforcement people, right, to give them good strategies for relating to people who are going through this, right? And have it hopefully be one that really leads to healing and understanding rather than needless pathologizing.
And what about politically? I mean, it seems like also there's just so much territory where law comes in describing how a specific thing is the best for the whole collective. Like, this should be this way. And so how do you see interfacing with healthcare law?
This is really interesting. So healthcare law, the most interesting thing it's going to run into is the sense of what is the current standard of care? And standards of care are variable things. So they change depending on your clinical setting, on the type of practitioner you are. They change by country and healthcare system and even region of countries sometimes. And they're a question of judgment. And so the biggest thing is if people are using various ways of diagnosing and managing disease, that you can demonstrate that there is evidence for this to provide the kind of scientific backing such that we can say this is within the acceptable range of the standard of care. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe there isn't good data to support certain practices. Or maybe the data even says, no, you really should not be doing certain things. So for example, insomnia care, cognitive behavioral therapy was just recently, recommended to be first line for insomnia rather than before medications or sleep hygiene or other things may have been recommended. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy at the moment is the darling of the insomnia clinical policy recommendation world. But these things change. And so we would like to provide the evidence that if people are using some of these strategies, you could determine, is this a reasonable standard of care or not? So the whole point is comparative clinical management trials. And that involves of diagnostic strategies, of management strategies. So that would involve pharmaceutical trials, right? So what is the role of pharmaceuticals in emergent phenomena? There are essentially no studies that really show which medications may have indications because there are no diagnostic categories that represent these things. So they have, bipolar and psychosis and schizophrenia and schizotypal and cyclothymia and things like that. But that's a relatively small palette in comparison to the wide range of what we see in emergent phenomena. And so there are plenty of emergent phenomena that have no equivalent diagnostic code, and so they have no indication because there's never been a clinical trial that has ever showed, does this medicine work and how well, and lead to what other wanted effects and unwanted effects in clinical contexts related to most emergent phenomena. And so this is all going to be human trials. For biofeedback methods, it's human trials. For more cognitive-based methods, for meditative or spiritual technique methods, for plant medicine, psychedelic methods, this is all clinical trials.
So you'll be building out strategies and models around patient recruitment and how to actually get people into understanding the risks that they're taking, but also the value proposition and benefits that can come from this. And so there's a whole system that needs to be created around that as well, too, I'm imagining.
Absolutely.
When you're doing this research and you're submitting to, there's the board, right? Like for review, for clinical research review, do you foresee challenges in terms of actually getting studies approved from a compliance perspective?
So that's been an interesting thing. So we've dealt with a number of institutional review boards. And because this is still considered very taboo, which is interesting because people have been dealing with these issues for thousands of years, well documented, and probably tens of thousands of years not well documented, we still face pushback from some institutional review boards that think this is odd or strange, or they don't really understand what we're doing. And helping to help them understand why this is important is a part of why we're creating videos like this, why the EPRC project. I mean, the weird irony of this is we have people with like double doctoral degrees, MD, PhDs at some of the best universities in the world in, departments that relate directly to this, that yet would be afraid to even tell their colleagues about some of the most important, transformative, seemingly healing and perspective-enhancing experiences of their entire lives. And so we think that by bringing a sense of legitimacy of this in terms of a field of study, in terms of its clinical relevance, in terms of its public health relevance, is going to enable many, many people who have been in the closet, essentially, about these experiences. I mean, the interesting thing is now there are so many things you can be out of the closet about, but not deep meditative attainments, not transformative healing from various spiritual and emergent modalities. Why can't you be out about those? It doesn't make any sense, right? And this just creates shadow sides, and it creates people who are in the institutions that are supposed to be about, validating and exploring highest truths, the deepest mysteries. And yet these are some of the deepest mysteries that are still taboo, still totally untouchable in some departments, still considered forbidden, or just totally in the closet. And I've talked to numerous people in government, numerous people in the security industry, numerous people at 3- and 5-letter agencies, that are some of the most secretive, who have had these phenomena occur to them, and yet do not feel comfortable discussing this. When this is important stuff, we need to know about these things from a lot of points of view. And so being able to have the conversation is one of the most critical things. And that's one of the things that we hope the work of the EPRC will allow, is a very open, robust public dialogue, and people able to come out of the closet and say, hey, this is important for me, and this is why I think this is important for society, for humanity. This is the research that really calls to them. We have a lot of researchers who never thought they would get to research any of this,
even though it is the thing they're most curious about in their lives. And suddenly they see the opportunity and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a revelation, right? That they might actually be able to pursue their deepest dreams of uncovering some of these truths. And so that's what we're very excited about.
In a very practical way.
Right.
Yeah. All of these studies sounds like it's a pretty, a big undertaking and a lot of organization between all these different people and places. So who and how and what do you consider to be funding sources to actually maintain the engine of this?
So the vast majority of the money so far has come from philanthropists, often in the cryptocurrency space, often in the brain hacking space, often in the neurotech startup space. But we've also gotten some money from business practitioners who are not in those spaces, and people who just are involved in deep meditation, but involved in other industries, for their job. But personally, in their lives, they've had these phenomena, or they know people who have had them, and so they have some reason to think this is valuable. And we think that the number of people who are experimenting with their consciousness now, who have reasonable resources, meaning the millions to tens of millions that it's going to take for each of these studies, that they will have an interest in saying, hey, of course we need to build the healthcare infrastructure to support us and our family members and our friends and our children and our children's children, to be able to, if they choose to go into this territory or find themselves in this territory even without meaning to, then they have support structures in place wherever they find themselves in the world, right? And so that's why we hope to have this scale globally. But most of the money, we think, initially is going to come from philanthropy. And then we think we will start hopefully getting more traction with National Health Services and the NIH out of the United States and other governments as they start to realize, wait a second, there's a there. There's something to this. This is not all just sort of weird woo-woo, but we can actually demonstrate this. This has some practical, clinical, functional utility and relevance. And once we have our diagnostic strategies in place, then you can start doing epidemiology, the study of the incidence and prevalence of these in populations. So if we start with phenomenology, move to taxonomy and then diagnosis, then these population-based studies will allow us to appropriately allocate public health dollars to monitor long-term impact, both positive and negative. And so we can get a sense of what are the economic implications of emergent phenomena in terms of inspiring creativity and healing, or in terms of causing people to be unstable, or having problems with their families, or raising their children, or with debt, or career instability, or whatever it is. And so we can look at the broad range of effects of emergent phenomena and deal with them in a way that makes sense, because it's driven by data, not orthodoxy or just ignorance or speculation. And so one of the unique things of the EPRC is we're coming into this, we're not pro or con any of this stuff. We just want to be able to do the good science. And so helping to provide a very neutral, objective, thoughtful analysis of what is available in terms of people dealing with emergent phenomena, good, bad, and weird, then getting that available to the public globally on the internet and having a reputable source, kind of like UpToDate does for medicine. We think UpToDate needs whole sections on emergent phenomena and their best practices for management and cultivation. Or the British Medical Journal does some exquisite reviews, or Cochrane reviews. We think that we need to provide those very, very respectable, well-established bodies of clinical knowledge with good data, good science, very objectively well done and well analyzed from a neutral perspective that is just interested in what is true to the degree that we can determine it with current methods, and get that in the hands of those excellent reviewers such that they can turn those into, very good, robust, well-researched clinical recommendations and help us influence in positive ways to upgrade the capabilities of the clinical mainstream, right? Because my colleagues, again, in medicine, they went into this to know stuff and help people. And we want to put the tools and the understandings of the underlying
mechanisms of this in their hands such that they can do what they do better. And in fact, such that all the traditions can do what they do better. We think all of the world's religions will benefit from our research. We think everybody who's a solo spiritual practitioner or putting together their own hybrid tradition or trying to make decisions of how to use their precious vacation time or resources, in terms of enhancing their own practice. Well, what really works? And what do we mean by works? What are the various effects that you can cultivate? What are the things that might be very risky but might lead to high reward? What are the things that just lead to a high degree of emotional or functional stability? These are the questions we want to help answer, to help people in various stages of life, in various places in their practice, in various situations to make good informed decisions. Imagine if you could go to your clinician and say to them, hey, I was thinking of doing a 2-week intensive meditation retreat, or thinking of doing a high dose of something like psilocybin, and just be able to have that as a straightforward, non-taboo conversation.
And how that connects back to healing within what you're
exactly
what's coming through the body and the mind.
Right, and being able to have really good data given your goals and your ideas of what is a good outcome, to be able to answer that in a reasonable way, with a reasonable degree of certainty of what the range of probabilities are of what might occur from those kinds of actions. I mean, that's obviously would be a vastly better world than what we have now.
And where would you put trauma, the concept of trauma and trauma in general that people are experiencing into this model?
That is a huge one. And trauma obviously is getting a lot of attention these days, and rightly so. And it is not well studied how much of the range of emergent phenomena is related to trauma. Trauma is often associated with the clinical mainstream, but is becoming more and more part of the dialogue of the alternative and more spiritual, religious, etc. practices as well. And it is not well known how much of the emergent phenomena one might see is related to trauma. So in the example I used earlier of the guy who's having the bright white light and sense of energy shuddering up his spine, is that related to trauma? We don't know. Are there any studies that actually look at that? I've never heard of any, but they may be out there, but they should certainly be done. Or if someone was having odd muscle spasms or seeing visions of things, what portion of visions can be tied to trauma? And then the other question is, how does that help you do something clinically? So how would that help you manage this? What sort of therapies allow people to go into the trauma and perhaps resolve this? And then the other question is, how can emergent phenomena help heal trauma? So there are reports of emergent practices, psychedelics, and meditation healing people's trauma as well. And so we think these interactions are very complicated and require sophisticated science and large outcome studies and very careful listening to patient experiences, to their histories, as well as prospective studies where we can follow people for a long period of time and really see what are the predisposing factors for both desired and undesired and just weird emergent phenomena. Is a trauma history related to more or less emergent phenomena? And if so, which ones? And what are the other predisposing factors? Are there genetic factors that lead to this, or epigenetic factors? Do more emergent experiences run in families? Is it how much is nature versus nurture? How much is coming up in specific environments? How much might be dietary? How much might be societal? How much might be media things or scripting or other ideals or ideas that one is exposed to that might lead to these phenomena? And how much of this just happens seemingly as a result of ordinary human physiology and attentional development in a way that has nothing to do with society, but is just part of the unfolding of something in our collective emergent process? And so those are some of the questions that we really want to help answer, and we don't know all the answers to.
So share with us about the centers within the organization.
So there are some centers that already exist that we're working with, such as the SEMA Lab at the University of Arizona with Jay Sanguinetti. And there are centers that we want to create such as the Emergence Research Center. The Emergence Research Center is one of our biggest dreams, where we hope to have a place where people can come and do their spiritual practices from a wide variety of traditions and do them in high doses so that we get to really see the interesting emergent phenomena that they lead to, get to see how they think about these emergent phenomena, how they cultivate the ones that they want to cultivate, how they mitigate the ones that they don't want, how they frame these, and then what the progression of these is in terms of the sequence in which they unfold and how the sequence that they actually unfold in compares to the traditional models that may be coming from that tradition of how it's supposed to unfold, and then to look at the long-term longitudinal outcomes and see what these practices actually lead to in terms of life function, in terms of, for the individual's health in their family, in their community, society, etc., and then be able to have all the imaging, latest and greatest imaging in-house, fMRI, EEG, other measurement modalities, to do biometrics, to be able to do qualitative and quantitative data analysis of their reports as they go through this, and to be able to look at functional outcomes in terms of how they're doing in their practices, and to look at what those all predict in terms of later longitudinal outcomes, to be able to have the resources to follow them up months and years later and see what are their thoughts on those practices and how their emergent effects evolved over time, to be able to look at all the predisposing factors we can measure in terms of genetics and epigenetics, family history, trauma, psychological history, diet, other health factors, age, their societal conditioning, etc., and how all of those contribute to the unfolding of emergent phenomena and their functional effects. And so that's one of the things we hope to be able to raise. We'd like to start with about $50 million. We think to create that center and fund it for hopefully the first 10 years or so, and then be able to have it be an ongoing contributor to the world literature on emergent phenomena, and to do this very ecumenically. So we brought in people from a wide range of backgrounds and traditions and frameworks, such that we're really doing our best to capture all of the best spiritual, emergent, etc. technologies from these groups, and to show what is most effective and helpful depending on the outcomes that people are trying to optimize for.
So what's the state of the art project? That sounds intriguing.
So the state of the art project is figuring out what is already done, what is already available in the wide range of like from the transpersonal literature, from across the indigenous traditions, from across the mainstream medical traditions. How are things now, and what are the range of options? Because our guess is, if you look at the various shamanic traditions or plant-based traditions or meditative traditions, that right now already there are a lot of cool technologies, frameworks, and ways of practicing that may lend a lot of value to care already. And how is that built on what has come before? So we have projects, for example, to explore various literatures that haven't even been translated ever into English or ever made it to the clinical mainstream or been even well appreciated in the countries and in the languages that they originated from. So, for example, there's a project with a guy named Pierce Salguero, who is at Penn State University and trained at Johns Hopkins, where we want to analyze the classical medieval Chinese literatures for how they relate to meditation sickness, right? What is what they would call it, or qi sickness. And so apparently there's a lot of interesting information there that has never been brought forth, and apparently it's a relatively sophisticated tradition. Mm-hmm. So going back and figuring out what has already been done before in a comprehensive way and a thoughtful way with an eye towards what scales and what could be tested practically and clinically in modern contexts and with modern scientific methods. and might be validated or dismissed as actually that doesn't work the way they thought it does, or maybe it really does. What undiscovered gems are back in these literatures of these traditions from across the globe? And so, and what are the mystical literatures? What do the mystical literatures of Christian mystics or Sufi mystics or Kabbalistic mystics, et cetera, and various Hindu and Buddhist and indigenous and other mystical traditions, what do those have to lend to this conversation? What is all of the phenomenology that has already been described and maybe even categorized? What are all of the ways of working with this? Is there a definitive compendium? We don't think there is. We think there needs to be, such that we create the definitive phenomenological compendium of emergent phenomena and of all the range of human experience. And then we can see what are common to the various traditions, what seem to be unique to specific traditions, what it is that may differentiate some of those things. And then because there are only so many biochemical pathways through which you could experience some of these things, we can start lining up what is common in human development across cultures, across traditions, across different human genetic populations, and figure out what are the unique things that maybe certain traditions have that none of the other traditions do. And that will help us differentiate, what is that they're doing that's different, and help us uncover and explore the mysteries of how these emergent phenomena occur, and what they are and at some sort of physiological level, and what their transformative capacities are. And so we don't think this has been definitively cataloged, and we think that it needs to be, such that it can be studied in the same way the naturalists, with that kind of curiosity, they just went into the jungles and the oceans and rocks and plants and insects, and they cataloged all of it so that they knew what was there. And once they knew all of what was there, they could study how these things were interrelated. Because you can't really understand an ecosystem unless you can understand all of the elements of the ecosystem. And so in the same kind of way for emergent phenomena, with that same curiosity and that same spirit of exploration and openness, we hope to build our taxonomies, both the pure taxonomies phenomenologically, the clinical taxonomies that seem to fall into diagnostic categories that seem to be based on various physiological mechanisms, biochemical mechanisms, and thus be amenable to being managed and or enhanced through various methods in terms of neurofeedback, in terms of biology. And so that's what we're really excited about in terms of creating some of these centers. That we have some people at major universities that are wanting to create these centers that I can't unfortunately tell you about. So that's why we would love to raise about $100 million in the next year or so to get a bunch of these projects off the ground and to enhance the ones that are already up and running.
Right now, in this moment, do you have priorities in terms of what you want to focus on first?
Yeah, so in terms of things right now, getting the Phenomenology Project off the ground is crucial. Emergence Benefactors, the charity that helps to fund all this stuff, is actively funding some people who are starting to establish the databases and the data sharing agreements and figuring out who is going to be able to do some of the data analysis and making sure that we have appropriate security and meet HIPAA compliance. And so the requirements of various universities in terms of access control and things like that. And we have people who are in place to work on phenomenological taxonomy. We've already started on what we call the Big Data Project, which is looking at some large social media databases and being able to take a look at those to see, because we think that populations have already been describing this and the natural outcomes of their experiments, of their practices, of these experiences they've been having, of their progression in populations in social media. And so there are numerous online forums and numerous other sites and situations where people talk about this and en masse. So we think there's already large population-based data on emergent phenomena, and we're working with some AI machine learning people, some text analysis people who are figuring out how to start actually looking at the data that is already available of what actually happens in real life. Because we have tremendous data on, the impact on consumer behavior, the impact on social function, the impact on mood. These are already well measured and described in terms of social media data. And so making sure we do all of that very ethically and use the publicly available data in ways that are skillful to try to figure out, again, how to promote good outcomes and just even understand the range of what's out there. What is it that people are experiencing such that we can normalize this as just being part of the human experience? Yeah. We can gain evidence for that, and then we can figure out how to incorporate that into clinical contexts.
Now, what about tractability?
So tractability is that we think these problems can be solved. We think with existing imaging technologies and existing biochemical techniques and existing scientific methods and the available descriptions that already exist and the capacity to generate new descriptions, the phenomenological methods, the anthropological methods, the economic analysis methods, and the linguistic methods and AI and machine learning and big data methods, that we can understand what the range of human emergent phenomenology are, how they relate to each other, a lot of their underlying biological mechanisms, what they tend to lead to in terms of good or bad outcomes, their predisposing factors. We think this is a very tractable problem. So we think that with existing technologies, we can already do the vast majority of this. It's largely at this point a question of finding all of the funds that we need to and finding the additional people. We currently have somewhere around 100 people working on this project, and we think it's going to take at least a few hundred.
How do you imagine building in like a checks and balances system where the EPRC doesn't take on its own ontology? And I would imagine that part of that is the diversity of the people that are actually coming together. And so it's kind of built in inherently into the process. Although I'm just curious to hear your opinion on that, because so many things can start in such sort of a neutral, innocent space and then take off and take on a whole sort of ontological view, and sometimes didn't even see it coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, in anything like this, that is a real risk. And it is entirely possible that whereas the EPRC now thinks of itself as playing the role of synthesis, where we're taking the thesis of clinical medicine, the antithesis of the alternative ways of viewing that, and then coming up with the skillful synthesis, nearly all syntheses end up then becoming a thesis to which there is an antithesis, and then yet another synthesis. And I very much welcome that process, because that's part of the iterative process of science, of communities, of societies, governments, and populations that tries to figure out what works. And what we might think of as working may change with time, with circumstances, with understandings. And so, of course, at some point, this is going to become something that somebody else is going, wait a second, hold on, and pointing out something about it that we hadn't seen. And I think that's great, right? And so I very much look forward to that kind of evolutionary, iterative conversation, which has been the history of religion and the history of science and the history of clinical medicine, where things go in, things come out, things we thought were great, not so much. Or actually, we really thought this worked. Oh, no, it didn't. Oh, now we do again. So over my medical career, I got to see a bunch of those things come in and out. And, we should be doing this. Oh, nope. And so that, of course, is going to happen. And we look forward to that being part of this. We would hate for this project to just become another fixed, dogmatic, ontological, institutional, ossified, solidified system, but instead hope it will be an encouragement to an ongoing dialogue that hopefully respects the ethical considerations and sensibilities of the time and the place. And it just happens that in this time and place, the dominant medical ethics are to, encourage things like patient autonomy, informed consent, risk benefits and alternatives, beneficence, non-malfeasance, justice, equity, etc. And so it may be at some point that those fundamental principles on which our project rests are now being questioned or morphing in some kind of way, in which case, obviously, a lot of this will need to be adapted or new things invented that help meet that new situation.
And it's even in the consortium itself. That's what you're breaking down these barriers and having these different biologists, statisticians, and all these different domains all coming together, even just in the research process itself. So what have you learned in the process just so far about bringing these domains together?
Well, the first thing is that it goes really well. Like when you get phenomenologists and neuroscientists together, this is just a better combination. And then when you get the mathematicians and the data analysis people and the people who can do machine learning and AI and algorithms for parsing through images and linguistic data and figuring out how to get together these different skill sets, there are tremendous synergies that just lead to better science and more interesting science and real breakthroughs. And so these are some of the strategies that we think are going to allow the EPRC to succeed where previous projects have not been successful. At the moment, we do not have all of the management structure in place that we need to make this happen. And so one of the things we've thought about and really want to fund is having curators that can take on each of these projects, some singly and some teams of curators, such as the Phenomenology Project. That's a tremendous amount of data to compile from a lot of sources, such as the Diagnostic Project, the Management Project, the Epidemiology Project, the Anthropology Project, the Linguistics Project, some of the business analysis, right? So the Neurophenomenology Project, some of the underlying biochemistry, that is a project. Each of these in some ways are unique fields of expertise. And to be able to actually fund full-time the high-level academics, so usually that means doctoral level or even double doctoral level, to have the sufficient expertise to manage these projects, to be able to fund them full-time, not just them, for long enough to actually do this. So what we dream of is funding full-time curators of each of those projects and sometimes teams of curators for some of the bigger ones, and then the people under them, so the researchers, the master's students, the PhD students, the postdocs, right, the technicians, the other data scientists, and other clinicians and things. We want to fund all of that as sort of pyramids that then form a grand sort of a council of curators that can collaborate together with a lot more resources to move these projects forward. What we envision is that eventually we will have the funds that most EPRC members who want to be can be just full-time on this.
Gotcha.
And not have to be, scraping after other grants to fund whatever the flashy thing of the moment is, right? Because the grant world and the world of grant allocation can be very trendy. But the thing is, we're actually very long-term. We're thinking we think this is generational change. We think it will take decades to do all this research properly. We think it will take decades to properly incorporate this into all of the places that we want it to be incorporated into. And so some of the long-term outcome studies will take decades to simply do. And so we're in this for the long game. And the problem is that funding can be very faddish, and we hope to give people the long-term career support that they can go into this with the sense that the money's going to be there, that they can feed their families, that they can eventually, hopefully, retire, and not retire in penury. And so that's one of the reasons that we're asking for the kind of funding, because a lot of people, we have a lot of talent waiting in the wings that has said, you get the money, we're there. And so that's a reasonable amount of money, right? So if you assume each of these people is going to be something like $160,000 to $250,000 US per year to fund them in their academic situations with the university overheads that they take, and then to fund whole labs under them and global collaborations that are robustly funded to do the imaging, to do the biochemistry, to do the phenomenology, to compile the clinical data, to do the prospective trials. That's a whole lot of money. And so that's why this is an expensive project from a certain point of view. We think, we can probably spend $500 million over the next 10 years, easily. When you think about it, to bring even a single drug through the FDA is something like $2.6 billion right now. And that drug might not even add any new capabilities to the clinical arsenal. It might just be a Me Too medication that is just another blood pressure medicine of the same class as a bunch of other blood pressure medicines, and might not really add anything new. We think that this is actually something of a bargain, that we could conceive of deep diving into this critical realm of human experience for that kind of money. And so we think this is a very, very affordable project from a certain, when you think about what big clinical trials cost. And to get this off the ground is relatively small money, but we actually think this is in some ways era changing. So when you look at like the medieval period to the Renaissance, or the Renaissance to the Age of Enlightenment, the modern era, postmodernism coming in, if you actually look at what a lot of these involved, they involved a paradigm shift related to ontologies, to existential questions, to meta-ontologies, to the relationship of science and spirituality, populations, clinical practice. Each of them ushered in a new era, and we actually think this project will usher in a new era if it's able to be brought to completion. That you could possibly bring in a new era for that kind of relatively small money is actually remarkable, and that we could really change the world and upgrade it substantially in ways that tremendous numbers of people envision. And so what we're looking for is philanthropists who can appreciate the long game, long institution building, long institutional change and upgrades, and figuring out how to do that at the global level. That takes mature philanthropy. Nothing about this is going to be quick, right? But it will be very important, and if we do it properly, it will structurally and fundamentally change global humanity's relationship to emergent phenomena in a very positive set of ways.
So let's say we're 100 years in and the EPRC has fulfilled its mission, it's fulfilling it, it's thriving. How does the world that we're living in, how are we experiencing that differently?
In the world that we dream of, mainstream healthcare providers, mental health providers, school counselors, the public at large, healthcare systems would have very sophisticated understandings of the range of emergent phenomena, their transformative potentials across the full range, a sophisticated set of tools for cultivating the ones that individuals appreciate and for helping to mitigate or avoid the ones that people do not want at that place in their life or time, and that this would be broadly accessible globally in a way that was very equitable and provided a high degree of value to people's lives. But speaking of that 100-year timeline, I should mention ecological issues and global issues. So one of the interesting things is we think about like 30, 40-year timelines or longer for some of the studies and the changes that we think are going to be needed and how long we think this may take given previous attempts to do this, and getting a sense of the inertia of these systems and these institutions that need to be convinced that this is a good idea. We wonder how much time we have. And this is an honest question that's obviously being asked on the global stage, is how much time do we have in the stable situation, or relatively stable situation, time of relative, by historical standards, affluence, relative global stability. Not that there aren't plenty of still hotspots in the world where there's trouble, but as history goes, this is something of a remarkable time. We hope that emergent phenomena and a skillful appreciation of them can be part of that process of figuring out how the planet and society can be okay. There's this sense that perhaps by increasing people's internal sense of fulfillment and well-being, that some of the global problems, if that can trickle out into society broadly enough, that this will help us deal with what seems to be coming and what some people think is coming, right, and which very well may be, which is potential ecological crisis, potential resource conflicts, potential issues of global instability related to weapons systems and militaries and all of that. And so we think ethically, for those who believe that these types of practices and experiences are going to be part of what may save us, then we think it's imperative that along with proceeding on all fronts to help global stability and sustainability, we also help our healthcare system help people who are going through these transformative processes.
When people have the capacity of their own, for their own health, for their own well-being, for their own, willingness to be in the unknown to a certain extent, it does extend out into the world. It extends out into healthy people, healthy culture, healthy planet. And so I appreciate that a lot, and I feel lit up by being able to actually offer the tools at right and meet people where they are. Meeting people where they are, so that actually in aggregate we come together and we can thrive in interdependence.
Yeah, and since these potential threats of ecological collapse or of societal instability are existential threats, those are existential risks, then if you believe that there is some role of emergent phenomena in mitigating existential risk, then it makes sense to have systems in place that understand those processes well globally. It also, you can look at existential risk as itself an emergent phenomena, because many of the emergent phenomena are related to deep questions of who we are, of how we can best be, and of questions of life and death, questions of existence itself. And since the global ecological crisis is an existential crisis, then in some ways it is a crisis of emergence. It is a crisis of human transformation, but in a potentially very negative way.
Yeah.
And so, given that this does seem to be having an impact on mental health, as some of the downsides of a spreading population, a population that may be out of some ecological balance or in some unsustainable mode, as we see more and more of those sorts of things and its impact on the planet, then there's this feedback loop between the existential crisis and the phenomena that people are experiencing. And so as that also increases, then we need healthcare systems that have an appreciation of these deeper issues and the deeper experiences and transformations that can come as people face up with the real threats to their own and their families and their societies and communities and ecosystems' well-being.
So let's say that somebody's watching this and they're understanding it, they're intrigued. What can they do next?
So you can reach out to the EPRC at info@theeprc.org. And we can get back to you and see if you're interested as being a researcher or a clinician or a study subject or a philanthropic donor or someone who may have an interest and wants to join to just lend some sort of support now, but is about to enter a degree program and is looking to do one's master's thesis or PhD dissertation on one of these topics, or looking to go into a clinical specialty like a medical specialty or even a data analysis or statistics or epidemiology, or as an MBA and thinks they can help us sort out some of the economic analysis, or as an economist or an anthropologist, a social scientist, a psychologist, so a nurse, an advanced practice provider. So we think that there are lots of ways that diverse ranges of people might be able to get involved. Or if you're coming from a traditional spiritual tradition, maybe you're clergy or a monastic or a religious leader, we would love to talk to you about your ideas about how to help people who are having emergent phenomena. And so there's an extremely wide range of expertise that might be able to help us with our project, and we're very interested in hearing from people who are willing to lend their time and talent.